So the Gemara started off with Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Rav Yehuda said the name of Rav, that the caper bush, if it's Arla, if it's within the first 3 years, outside of Israel, you could throw out the caper berries and you could eat the caper husks. And the Gemara understood from that the caper husks are not a fruit. If you could throw out the caper husks, throw out the caper berries and eat the husks, even though they're within the first 3 years of the fruit tree, it must be because this is not considered a fruit. And the Gemara said that doesn't seem to fit with a statement that deals with the laws of Brochos, because the laws of Brochos says you recite a boire pri ha'etz, you recite a fruit, thanking God for the fruit of the tree on the husks. So you're telling me I'm allowed to eat the husks within the first 3 years, but that doesn't seem to fit with the blessing. The blessing is that you recite the blessing on the husks of the caper berry. So because the blessing is boire pri ha'etz. So the Gemara answers that the reason why Rav holds you're allowed to eat the caper husks even during the first 3 years is because he follows Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva holds, in regards to the laws of Meiser, that the only thing that you take a tithe from, Meiser means a tithe, the only thing you remove a tithe from the caper bush is the caper berries. That's the fruit of the tree. You take but everything else from that tree, even though it's edible, but it's not really the fruit, and you therefore do not need to remove a tithing and give it to the Levite. And so, because of that, Rabbi Akiva, it sounds like Rabbi Akiva holds that everything else is not considered the fruit, only the caper berry. Now, what does that teach us with regard to the laws of Arla? With regard to the laws of Arla, that would mean that you're allowed to eat everything from the caper bush except for the caper berry. Because the caper berry, according to Rabbi Akiva, is the fruit. You have to tithe it. That would also be the fruit regarding laws of Arla, that you would have to leave it for 3 years. But everything else, part of that tree, would have the same thing as the laws of Meiser, as the laws of tithing. That Arla and tithing would be the same. And therefore, you would be allowed to eat the caper husks and maybe other stuff as well. And because Rabbi Yehuda Marav holds like Rabbi Akiva. He holds like Rabbi Akiva, who holds the only fruit is really the caper berries. The Gemara says that why doesn't he say the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva? Why does he make it as if it's his own verdict? And he says, you're outside of Israel, you're allowed to eat the caper husks. Why does he say that? He should say the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara answers because Rabbi Akiva says his law even in Israel. And Rabbi Yehuda Marav says that this law applies only outside of Israel. And the reason is because we're allowed to rely on a lenient view outside of Israel. So it's not that we really hold like Rabbi Akiva. It's outside of Israel. You're allowed to rely on Rabbi Akiva's view. So the Gemara asks still, say the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva outside of Israel. And because we're allowed to rely on the lenient views outside of Israel. So why don't you say that? Why are you making it as if it's your own verdict? Say that the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva outside of Israel because you're allowed to rely on lenient views outside of Israel because the laws of Arla have a certain leniency that we can rely on a lenient view if it's not in Israel. And so the Gemara answers that if we would say that the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva, it still wouldn't be so clear because we would think that the halacha might follow Rabbi Akiva outside of Israel only regarding the laws of Meiser, tithing, but not regarding the laws of Arla the first 3 years. Because we would say, yeah, we follow Rabbi Akiva and we're lenient because tithing is rabbinic even in Israel on a caper bush. And therefore outside of Israel is even less strict. And therefore we can rely on Rabbi Akiva's view and say that the only thing that needs to be tithed outside of Israel would be the caper berry and everything else could be. So we would rely on Rabbi Akiva regarding tithing outside of Israel. If he said these words, that we follow Rabbi Akiva outside of Israel, we would say that applies to tithing. However, we would not say that it applies to the laws of Arla, because we would say Arla, oh, that's a very strict law. Even in Israel, it's biblical. biblically in Israel, you have to keep the law of our law. Again, Meiser in Israel for a caper bush is not biblical, it's rabbinic. But the laws of Arla for a caper bush in Israel would be biblical. So therefore, you would say, outside of Israel, that you can't rely on Rabbi Akiva. You want to rely on Rabbi Akiva, that's regarding laws of tithing. Regarding the laws of Arla, that we have to be strict. And therefore, we still wouldn't know that you could follow Rabbi Akiva. Therefore, Rabbi Yehuda Marav says, you know what? Let me make it very clear. Regarding the laws of Arla for the caper bush, throw out the caper berries and eat the caper husks. That's what Rabbi Yehuda Marav says. And he doesn't make up this whole thing, follow Rabbi Akiva outside of Israel, because you're going to get confused. You're going to think it only applies to Meiser. It doesn't apply to Arla. It only applies to tithing. It doesn't apply to the first 3 years. He says, let me make it very clear. You're allowed to eat the caper husks that are less than 3 years old. On a tree that is less than 3 years old, you can eat the caper husks. And that's what he says, Rabbi Yehuda Marav. Now, interestingly enough, Ravina comes and sees Mar bar Rav Ashi doing exactly this thing. So the Gemara now leads to a story. Ravina sees Mar bar Rav Ashi. He sees the son of Rav Ashi who's doing exactly this. He happens to be eating right next to a tree that's Arla, that's within the first 3 years, and he's eating the caper husks, and he's throwing out the caper berries. So so Ravina asks him, do you hold like Rabbi Akiva? You know, you're going to be lenient. You hold like Rabbi Akiva. You're allowed to just throw out the berries and eat the husks. Why, if you're going to be lenient, follow Beis Shammai also. Beis Shammai holds in the laws of kilayim, the laws of mixtures between vegetables and the grapevine. The law is, according to Beis Shammai, that caper might be considered a vegetable, and therefore, according to Beis Shammai, you have rules that you can't really plant caper bushes in a vineyard, and you have to be careful if it was planted there, if any fruit grew, and so Beis Shammai holds that it might be considered a vegetable. At the same time, it might be considered a fruit, and therefore, he says you also have to be careful in the first 3 years of a caper bush. So he tells you both. He says, number one, you got to be careful that it might be Arla, because it might be considered a fruit. But he also says it might be a vegetable, and therefore you got to be careful if you plant it next to a vineyard. And what comes out from that is that Beis Shammai is unclear about the law of the caper bush. Beis Hillel says it's definitely a fruit, but Beis Shammai says that it might be a vegetable. Now, if that's so, being that that according to Beis Shammai it's a questionable Arla, you could be lenient. So why don't you eat the caper berries? This is what Ravina asks the son of Rav Ashi. He says, listen, according to Beis Shammai, it's considered a suffix. So you want to be lenient. You're following Rabbi Akiva. Be more lenient. Follow Beis Shammai. And you could eat the caper berries because according to Beis Shammai, it's a suffix. Now, the Gemara ends off that the son of Rav Ashi answers, there's a difference here. I might follow Rabbi Akiva instead of Rabbi Eliezer, but I'm not going to follow Beis Shammai instead of Beis Hillel, because Rabbi Akiva instead of Rabbi Eliezer, that's an accepted view. But to follow Beis Shammai instead of Beis Hillel, that's a no-no. You cannot follow Beis Shammai. We do not follow Beis Shammai. In fact, there is a Talmudic statement where there was a heavenly voice that called out the halacha follows Beis Hillel. So we don't follow Beis Shammai. The opinion of Beis Shammai. Now, don't think that from learning this that Beis Shammai is wrong. His view is part of Torah. And when Mashiach comes, it says that we are going to follow Beis Shammai. So even though our Gemara knocks off Beis Shammai as if he's not even eligible to be on the team, but he is. His view is a valid view. It's Torah, but it's not valid in practice. we are not allowed to follow it in practice nowadays because the halacha follows Beis Hillel. And so Beis Shammai is not considered acceptable view. And therefore, Mar Bar Avashi says, Rabbi Akiva, yes, I follow. I'm going to be lenient. And therefore, I'll eat the caper husks. I'm not going to eat the caper berries because that would be following Beis Shammai. That's a no-no. Caper husks, that's following Rabbi Akiva, that I can do. So Rabbi Akiva spoke. What case was Rabbi Akiva talking about? Rabbi Akiva was talking about the laws of Meiser. Beis Shammai is talking about the laws of Kilayim. They're talking about different cases, but the law here applies there. Each laws. The fact is, we're dealing with the question of, is this called a fruit or a vegetable? So if you call it a fruit, your law can apply to other cases as well. If you call it a vegetable, that law will apply to other cases as well. And therefore, even though their discussion might be about different laws, but the fact is, what they're arguing about is this called a fruit? And that boils down to an issue of, do I have to wait 3 years? What part of it do I have to wait 3 years for? And also, is this allowed to be planted near a vineyard? Yes, Susan.
Remind me what kilayim means, please.
Planting next to a vineyard, mixing stuff with the vine, mixing vegetables with the vine, or grain with the vine would be the main case of kilayim. Okay, so that is the Gemara so far, and we've just turned the page now to 36b. And the Gemara now asks another question, and that is that why would someone be allowed to eat the caper husks if the caper husks protect the caper berry? And anything that's a protection also falls under the law of Arla, under the law of keeping 3 years before you enjoy it, before you benefit from it. And therefore, if you're not allowed to eat the caper berry, you would also not be allowed to eat the caper husk. So Mar Bar Avashi, this rabbi, was eating the caper husks and throwing out the caper berries. And the Gemara is asking, shouldn't it be prohibited? Can't we derive the tapakle, which means can't we derive that it should be prohibited under the law of a shomer lapri, under a protection for the fruit? And the Torah says the extra word es, which teaches us that you have to keep arla even on protections for the fruit, not only the fruit itself. So there are some growths that would be considered a protection, like the shell, the husk, and that would be included in the laws of Arla. So even if you don't want to call it a fruit, but it would fall under the category of the protection for the fruit, and it should be prohibited. And this would apply to the laws of Arla, to the laws of the first 3 years. It wouldn't apply to Kilayim. It wouldn't necessarily apply to the laws of blessings. It's a protection for the fruit, but it would apply to the laws of Arla. And we would say that being that it's a protection for the fruit, it wouldn't apply to the laws of Meiser either. And Rabbi Akiva talks about Meiser. Rabbi Akiva talked about the laws of Meiser. We're jumping and saying that this law should apply to Arla, and therefore we're allowing people to eat the husks of the caper. And the question is, there's another rule. Forget about whether it's called a fruit or not a fruit. Who cares? It's called a protection for the fruit. Protection for the fruit is anyway prohibited. So how could Mar Bar Avashi be eating the husks? Again, this is not a question on Rabbi Akiva. It's not a question on the laws of Kilayim, on Beis Shammai. It's not a question on all these cases. And it's not a question on the laws of blessings. It's a question on the laws of Arla. Mar Bar Avashi was eating these fruits from a tree that's less than 3 years old. He's eating the husks, not the fruits, the husks from the tree, from the caper bush, the husks of the caper berry. And the Gemara is saying that should be prohibited under the law of of a protection for the fruit falls under the same category as the fruit itself. And it's prohibited within the first 3 years. And so that is the Gemara's question.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I have a question about Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. If Beis Shammai, we don't follow his rulings, why would anybody go to the yeshiva of Beis Shammai? If he's losing the argument all the time, why would anybody go there? You would think that automatically people would want to go to the winning side where it's Beis Hillel, where he wins all the time.
So it seems like the Basco must have happened afterwards. In other words, in the time of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, it wasn't so. If I'm right, I don't know, Isaac, am I correct? Was the Basco much later?
There are 13 times where Beis Shammai is the halacha.
Yeah, but David is asking who would want to be part of that. I would want to be where you're always right. If you could be on a legal team that's always right, or you could be 13 times out of 1,000 where you're right, wouldn't everyone want to join Beis Hillel? It's a good question, right? You want to pick the winners.
Rabbi?
Yes.
People like to be loud.
I think it's not always who is right. Here it's an issue of who is strict and who is lenient. So depending on the person, if he's a lenient person or if he's a strict person, as to what yeshiva he would want to go to.
That is a good explanation. David, do you like that?
Well, the thing is, if you're always strict, then halach is not like you. It's always like the guy who's lenient. It's still not good because you're following what ends up being not the halacha.
So you're not
That's how you feel. That's how you feel.
Yeah, but how you feel is not the halacha. How a person can be machmir with himself, but to be to be strict with everybody else, and it ends up that's not the halacha in the end. So it sounds like you're
follow
joining
the halacha, but you don't change your opinion.
So it seems that my other answer you're going to have to be satisfied with, which is that the halacha was decided after the Basco came afterwards. I could look it up, but it's a Gemara, I think, in Eruvin, and so I believe it's a Gemara. I believe it's a Gemara in Eruvin where it mentions the Baskel. Let me just mute everyone. There's a lot of noise. Okay, so the story is that the Gemara tries to answer this question of the fruit, the caper berry, that although the caper berry is the fruit and the husk is called a protection for the fruit, and you might want to say the husk should also fall under the category of being prohibited because it's within the first 3 years, and we learn from the word S to include the first 3 years, but we're going to have to differentiate between the caper husk and other protections from fruits. And that's what the Gemara is going to be dealing with. How do we differentiate and say that the husks of the caper bush are really different than other protections of fruits? And the Gemara starts off by saying that if the caper husk is not there when the fruit is harvested, in other words, when you harvest that fruit, there's no husk on the fruit, so then it's not really a protection for the fruit after the fruit is, it's not a protection for the fruit after the fruit has been ripened or harvested. Actually, at this point, it's about being harvested. So because it's not been harvested yet, therefore, that's not called a protection. Protection is when it protection is when it is there after it's harvested, when it really needs the protection after it's harvested. And so that is not called protection. Therefore, the caper husks would be permissible. Now, the Gemara is not satisfied with that. And the Gemara says, because we have the case of the pomegranate. And the pomegranate, we said that the nates of the pomegranate, again, there's the different parts on the top of the pomegranate. And what I tried to look into this a little more. It seems that there's a middle part on top, there is a in-between part, and then there's the outer crown. We're talking about a part that's somewhere in between the middle stem and the outer crown. And we're saying, we brought a Mishnah that said that the nates is not mitzdaref. It doesn't join it doesn't join to be considered impure to make something else impure. And what that means is that it's not a fruit. Now, the Gemara then says, it's not food. And then the Gemara says that it's obligated in Arla in the first 3 years. So what we see from here is that even though the nates, which does fall off, and it's not considered the regular part of the fruit, because if it was, then it would be part of the laws of impurity. It would fall under that category of impurity, and it doesn't. And yet, it does have the laws of Arla. So what we see is that even something that's not there, when the fruit is harvested, it does have obligations of Arla of the first 3 years. And that would go back now to the case of the if we take it now to the case of the caper bush. So you would have the caper husks are not there when they're harvested, but they still should fall under the category of Arla because they're still considered protection for the fruit, just like the nates of the pomegranate. So the pomegranate has something that's called protection for the fruit, and that's not there when it's harvested. And yet, it's considered a protection. So the same thing is the caper husks. Now, the Gemara says that we have to come up with a different differentiation. So the Gemara says that when the fruit is ripe, that's when you need to have the husk, and that's when it's considered a protection. So even though it's still attached to the fruit, but at least the fruit is ripened. So when it's ripened on the bush and it has a husk, that would be called a protection. A caper berry is not that way. It's attached, but once it gets ripened, it's already not there. The husk is already partially fallen off. It's not really protecting it by the ripening. but differently, it's different by a pomegranate. A pomegranate, it is there. Therefore, you have to keep arla by the nates of the pomegranate, but you don't have to keep arla by the nates, by the husk of the caper bush. So that's what the Gemara is trying to say now. But the Gemara says, but that doesn't work, because what are you going to do about dates? And the Gemara says, what about dates? Dates, we know that you have to keep the laws of arla even when the date is tiny. And the cover, this I don't know what it's called on a date, but this husk of the date is only there when they're unripe. It's not there when they're ripe. And still we have the laws of arla, and we're calling it a protection for the fruit. So what the Gemara is proving is that all of our differentiations aren't valid, aren't legal. I know we're trying to differentiate and say, well, you don't have to keep the laws of arla when it's you don't have to keep the laws of arla when it's either when it's not, when it's when the husk is not there when it's harvested. Then we wanted to say when the husk is not there when it's ripened, even if it's not harvested. But if it's not there when it's ripened, then we're saying even when it's not ripened, you still have to keep the laws of arla on the husks. So what comes out is all of our differentiations didn't work. So we're going to now, the Gemara is going to explain that, no, it's not a problem. This view that you bring about the dates, about the husk of the dates, that only applies according to one view. That's Rabbi Yossi. This is one view that holds that dates, even at a very young age, they're considered ripe. Rabbi Yossi holds that. It's considered the ripening, not dates. He speaks about smodar, and Rav Nachman holds, he follows Rabbi Yossi's view that smodar, which means grapes that are before they're ripened, they are considered a fruit. And according to Rabbi Yossi, also dates would fall under the same category. They're called a fruit, and therefore they would have the laws of a guard for the fruit would also apply. And the rabbis argue on that, and therefore our case is Mar Barabashi is eating the husks of the caper tree, the caper bush. The husks would be considered permissible. So that's what this is exactly where we're holding. So I'm going to read that inside. What I just told you now outside, I'm going to now read it inside. And I hope I didn't lose you. It is a very confusing Gemara. This is not one of the easier Gemaras. It's a lot of back and forth. So, but we are just about to finish, and I hope to finish before the end of the day. Yes, Susan.
One question. You never mentioned the part of the pomegranate that you eat. It's still considered a fruit, correct?
Of course it's a fruit.
And we throw away most of the product, and only there's a very thin thing around some seeds. That's the only part that's edible. The seeds are not edible, correct?
I mean, I think people eat the seeds of pomegranates.
Okay. But the laws of
But anyway, we're not our reason to bring the pomegranates was not to talk about the seeds. The reason we brought the case of pomegranates was to talk about something that is considered a protection for the fruit, if that is considered included in the laws of arla.
I see. Okay.
And that's the only reason we brought it. So we're definitely not interested in talking about the laws of the pomegranate. We only wanted to know the laws of the
so the blessing is for the fruit.
Yeah, we're jumping now from the laws of blessing now because we got sidetracked.
Okay.
We're dealing with the laws of arla. Okay. And that's all we're caring about. And we're trying to figure out how the caper husks are allowed to be eaten if they're considered a protection for the fruit.
Okay.
And so we initially answered that it's not a protection for the fruit because the fruit is harvested, it's not there once it's harvested. Then we said it's not a protection because it's not there when the fruit is even on the tree and it's ripened. The husk is already partially fallen off and it's not protecting it. And then the Gemara said that doesn't work. And the Gemara said, well, doesn't work because even when it's not ripe, it's still considered a protection for the fruit. And that's we find by this example of the example was the case. Yeah, just 1 second. That's probably fine. Okay. So the Gemara asks a question from the case of the husks of dates that we see from there that it's even the dates are not even ripe, and yet we are concerned. Yet we are, even though they're totally not ripe, we are still considering the husk to be considered a protection. So that really knocks off all of our differentiations. And now the Gemara is about to answer that this view about if it's not ripe by a date is really a view that's based on the grape law. And the grape law is that there's one rabbi that holds that grapes that are not ripe, they really are considered a fruit, even at a very unripe stage. And the same law would apply to dates. And that's why this view holds that the husks of dates, even when they're not ripe, it is considered protection because it's considered a fruit. So let me just clarify one point, and then we're going to look inside. The one point I want to clarify is that the Gemara is trying to emphasize that something that is a fruit needs to be protected. And the protection would be the husk. And if we consider it, the husk, that it's on the fruit, when the fruit is called a fruit, then that husk is considered the laws of Arla. You have to keep the laws of 3 years. But if the fruit is not a fruit yet, because it's too young, it's too unripe, then the protection is not called a protection for a fruit. And then you don't have to keep the laws of Arla. So that's the main point that we're saying. That what is called a fruit? If this fruit is called a fruit, so initially we assume that when it's ripe. A fruit is when it's ripe. And if a fruit is when it's ripe, then the husk must be on it when it's ripe if we want to call it protection for a fruit. But if it's only on it when it's unripe, then it's not called a protection for a fruit. It's a protection for something that's not a fruit. That you don't have to keep Arla for. Only if it's a protection for a tree, for a fruit. And that's based on the words. The words say, it's fruit, it has to be S, a protection for the fruit. If it's not a fruit, it's not considered a protection for the fruit, and you don't have to keep the laws of Arla. So this is what we're boiling down. This whole issue is now boiled down to the case of dates and grapes, because we're now saying that dates, even if they're not a fruit, you have to keep the laws of Arla, which knocks off this premise that I just said. I just made a premise that if something's a fruit, then the protection for the fruit you need to keep Arla. And if something's not a fruit yet, it's unripe, you don't have to keep the laws of Arla. We seem to find by the case of the husks of these unripe dates that you have to keep the laws of Arla for the husks, even though it's not really a fruit yet. And it seems what we're saying is even something unripe would be called even something like that would be called a fruit, and you would have to keep the laws of Arla on the husks. And this would end up being a question on what Mar Bar Rav Ashi did, eating the husks of capers, which do fall off before the fruit is ripe, would we call that fruit a fruit even when it's unripe? That's really what it boils down to. If it's a fruit, so do we call a fruit that's unripe? Do we call it a fruit? If we call it a fruit, then the husks would be considered arla. And if we don't call it a fruit, then the husks are not called arla. Do you call an unripe fruit a fruit? That's the question. So let me read it inside.
Rabbi, what
Yes.
happens when it's changing over from unripe to ripe? So the status is changing from one
You want to know if
category.
there's an intermediate stage?
Yeah, like what happens? A person has something that's not orla, and all of a sudden he comes down the next day and it's more ripe, and now it's orla.
No. We are not saying if this fruit is, we're not talking about a specific tree. We're talking about are the law of caper husks. Do caper husks stay on? We don't care about the specific tree. It's the husks, are they considered protection for the fruit or not? If they stay on when the fruit is considered a fruit after it's ripe, that would be considered a that would be considered arla. If they are not on if the husk falls off before the fruit ripens, before such a fruit ripens, we don't need to know. You don't need to know your specific tree, and it's the general caper bushes. Are there husks on them? When as protection. Do they give protection? Just because this one little fruit happens to be protected because the husk never fell off, I don't know if that would. I don't think that would prohibit it. It's the general. This husk is considered a protection for the fruit, and the husk of a different fruit might be different. You know what I mean? We're looking at trees in general. What the caper bush has this root. The avocado has this root. We're talking about general. So you're asking more of a specific case. What happens if you might come down and it's still on? But we're talking in general. The caper bush, is that husk from the caper berry? Is that husk considered a protection for the fruit or not? So it's more general. Yes, Ben.
What I have a problem with that they calling bushes trees.
Well, you do it all the time. What bracha do you say on
I do
on a
it
blueberry?
because I'm told to do it.
That's it. Just
But
listen.
the bush
Just
is
follow
not
the rules.
a real tree. But the other thing is,
who
as far
told
as
you?
food,
Who
Rabbi,
told you what a tree is? Who told you?
nobody told me, but to me, anything big is a tree. Anything
Well, you're
that's
wrong.
2-3 feet is a bush.
Ben,
If
you gotta humble yourself. The Torah is what tells you what is a tree.
Right. That's why I'm saying.
That's it.
But the other thing is, to me, anything that ends up as a fruit is a fruit from the first day. I don't care if it has a husk for a while or not, but it ends up a fruit, it's a fruit. But the husk doesn't have to be considered part of the fruit. Like you explained, if it falls off before you pick it, it's not part of the fruit. It's just a protection.
So the question that we're dealing with is the husk of a unripe fruit, is that called protection for a fruit? No, do we call unripe fruits fruits?
It's a protection, but it's
is
not
it of a protection of a fruit?
It's not part of the fruit.
It's not part. We know it's not part, but is it a protection of a fruit? That's what the Gemara is really dealing with. Is this called a protection of a fruit? Because if it's unripe, is that called a fruit? So the Gemara now brings the source. Now we're going to read this inside. Aini, is that so? This is about maybe 17 lines from the top. Aini, we're 36b. Aini, is that so? That only something that's there, a husk that's there by the ripening of the fruit, is called a protection of a fruit. But if it's there only earlier and it falls off, then it's not called the protection of a fruit. Didn't Rav Nachman say in the name of Rabba Barabua, Hani Masachali da Arla, these young dates of Arla, Asiri, not the young dates, the husks of the young dates. Hani Masachali, these these husks of young dates of Arla are prohibited. Asiri, because they're considered a protection for the fruit. When are these considered a protection for the fruit? They are considered a protection for the fruit. Bekufra, when the fruit is really young, only when they're really young, because afterwards they fall off. So these masachali that we're calling them a protection, they're only there when the fruit is very young. They're not there afterwards. And this statement of Rav Nachman in the name of Rabbi Baravua says that it's called a shomer. You got to keep the laws of Arla. It's called a protection for the fruit. That means that we call fruits, even that are unripe, we call that fruits, and anything that's protecting it, even when it's unripe, is called a protection for a fruit. And that would mean that the caper husks would be prohibited. So the Gemara answers, no, this is one view. This is the view of Rabbi Yossi. Let's see inside. Rav Nachman Savala Rabbi Yossi. Rav Nachman holds like Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says this law about grapes, and that same law would apply to dates. Because we learned in a Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi says that smadar aser, a smadar, which is a young grape before it's ripened, it is, if it's Arla, it is prohibited. This is a Mishnah in Arla, and it says that it's aser of neshahu pri, because it's considered a fruit, and therefore, according to Rabbi Yossi, the same law would apply to dates. That dates also, when they're young, they're called a fruit, and therefore, if it has a husk on it, at that point, it's called a husk of a fruit, and therefore it would be prohibited as part of Arla the first 3 years. But of course, upligi rabbanan alei, but the rabbis argue on this, and they say this is not called a fruit, only when it ripens. And according to that, we could say that the same thing applies to caper bush. The caper husks are not there. They're not protecting it after the fruit is ripe. And therefore, they're not called a protection for the fruit. And therefore, you can eat the caper husks even if they are Arla within the first 3 years. Now, the Gemara asks and says, this is not so. Maskif lo Rav Shimi min Arda. Rav Shimi from Nerda asks, Uvashar ilani mi pligi rabbanan alei. Do the rabbis argue by other trees? Would the rabbis argue and say that other trees, when they are young, it's not called a fruit? V'hatanan, didn't we learn in a Mishnah, and this is now jumping to the laws of Shemitah. This year is a Shemitah year in Israel. Now we're going to jump to a new set of laws, the laws of Shemitah. During the Shemitah year, you're not allowed to cut down and ruin things. And of course, we know you're not allowed to ruin things ever. It's called Bal Tashtis, but sometimes there is a benefit in destroying something. And therefore, it's not Bal Tashtis, but regarding the laws of Shemitah, could be prohibited. So, for example, let's say it's a tree that causes you much more work and it only gives off a few fruits every year. So according to halacha, you would be allowed to destroy that tree. Now, I'm not saying that it's accepted in halacha. There's different issues, but the straight halacha would seem that would be permissible to destroy such a tree. Again, I'm not advising the person to do it. They would have to ask a Rav. There's a lot of complications in this, but according to straight halacha, should be permissible to cut down a tree if the tree is only giving you a few fruits because it's causing you more work than the amount of fruits that it's making. So there's no iser bal tashkis on cutting down such a tree. Nevertheless, in Shemitah, you wouldn't be allowed to do that because you're taking Shemitah fruits and destroying them. Shemitah fruits have a certain holiness to them. So if you cut down that tree, you're destroying some of those Shemitah fruits, and that would be a problem. Now, the thing is, if they're not really fruits yet, it's not a problem. If they're not fruits yet, for example, if they're unripe or very, certain, depends what we wanted. That's what we're trying to figure out, actually. What is considered fruits? If it's considered a fruit, then you're destroying Shemitah fruits. If it's not considered a fruit, then you're not destroying a Shemitah fruit, and it should be permissible what you're doing. So the Gemara is asking that we have a source here that's going to tell us about cutting down, because you're only allowed to eat the Shemitah fruits. You're not allowed to destroy them. So from when is a person not allowed to cut down the trees, fruit trees on Shemitah? And the idea is that we want to make sure that it's not fruit yet. So Beis Shammai Yomrim Kol Ha'ilanos Misha Yotziu. Beis Shammai says that all the trees from when they give off Misha Yotziu, from when they come out. And what that means is that when they bring forth fruits. But Beis Hillel says, what does this word mean? Incipient. Anyone know what incipient means?
That's what I was asking.
When they bring forth.
Incipient?
Yeah.
The very, very beginning.
Okay. So Beis Shammai says once it gives off a tiny blossom, or after the blossom, tiny fruit, that's already called prohibited to destroy such a tree.
He says here from when the blossoms fall off and
there's a tiny
begins to emerge in its earliest stage.
Earliest stage. Okay, great. So the earliest stage. Thank you, Isaac. The Beis Shammai holds even the tiniest fruit just emerged. Beis Hillel says Hacharuvim Misha Yasharsharu. The carob trees, when they form a chain, and what that means is that the way the carob tree works, it looks like chains at a certain stage, and that would be considered a fruit at that point. And at that point, you wouldn't be allowed to cut down that tree. But Hagefanim and the Gefanim are the grapevines, Misha Yigaru, when they grow grapes the size of a Gerua. And we'll see later what that means, but because the Gemara is going to discuss that. V'hazesa Misha Yanitzu, and the olives when the nates develops, and there's this nates that grows around the olive, and some type of a Misha Yanitzu. When the nates grows, that is when it's considered prohibited to cut them down for Shemitah. Now, Ushar Kol Ha'ilanos, and this is the main statement here. All the other trees may not be cut down from when it brings forth Misha Yotziu, once it brings forth a tiniest little fruit. V'amar Rabasi, and Rabasi says, when we talk about the grape, hu baiser, hu gerua, hu poil halava, that we said gerua, misha yigaru. What is gerua? It is the same as baiser, and which is a very early stage of its development, and that's the same as poil halavan when it's the size of a white bean. Now, initially, the Gemara says it is a white bean. It doesn't mean the size of a white bean. The Gemara says, what does that mean? The grape is a white bean. Poil halavan sal kadaitach ela ema shiyuroi kapal halavan. It means the size of a white bean. So the point is that the law of trees the law of the grapes, according to this Mishnah, or this Mishnah, according to this Mishnah, the law of grapes, it uses the term gerua, which is beiser, which is a little later than the stage that we said earlier, according to Rabbi Yossi, who said smodar. This is a little later. It's a later stage than smodar. Smodar, we said Rabbi Yossi holds. Smodar is prohibited for Arla. And here we're talking about Shemitah, and we're saying that the grape is considered a grape once it reaches the stage of Beiser, which is, again, a little later than Smodar. Now, Man Shamet Le Damar Beiser in Smodar Lo. About whom do we say that Beiser is considered a fruit, but the Smodar is not? Again, Rabbi Yossi held the Smodar as a fruit. The Rabbanon, the rabbis, are the ones who hold that they must hold the other opinion, which is that the Beiser is a certain stage of the grape. That's considered, when the grape is the size of a white bean, that's considered a fruit. Now, Uktani, and we learned, Sha'ar kol ha'ilanais misha yotziu, and we learned all other trees cannot be cut down once they bring forth a tiny fruit. So we're definitely talking about the rabbi's view here, because this cannot fit with Rabbi Yossi. And yet we're saying that main point that I told you is all the other trees, when do we consider them a fruit? Once they give off a tiny, tiny, immature type of growth. So once they give off this immature growth, it is considered a fruit. So therefore, we see that that's called a fruit. You can't cut down a tree for Shemitah. The same thing should apply to the laws of a protection for a fruit. That the protection is even when the fruit is a tiny, the tiny growth. Ella Amar Rava, so therefore Rava has to come up with the final answer. Heicha Amrinon, when do we say Dahave Shomer Lepri, that it's considered a protection for the fruit? Heicha de Kisha Chaltole, when you take it, Lashomer, you take the protection away, Mayas Pera, the fruit dies. Hacha here, Kisha Chaltole, when you take away this protection, the husk of the caper, Loy Mayas Pera, the fruit will not die. And have a ubda, and there was a story, Vishakluha Lanates, the Rimaina, they took the nates of the Rimain, the Yavesh Rimaina, and the Rimain, the pomegranate died. They took the nates, so we see the nates is considered a protection for the pomegranate. Vishakluha Lapircha de Bitisa, but they took the protection, the growth, that husk of the Bitisa, which is the caper berry, and the Ikayim Bitisa, and the Bitisa existed, it lived. And therefore, we see from here that it boils down to what is considered a protection for the fruit. If when you take it off, the fruit will live, it's not a protection. When you take it off, the fruit dies, that is a protection for the fruit. And therefore, would you be allowed to eat caper husks? The answer is yes, because if you take it off, the fruit will still live, and therefore it's not a protection for the fruit. So again, what we did over here was, and this was a little confusing because it brought in a whole new case of the laws of Shemitah, and we spoke about the different trees of Shemitah, but what it boiled down to was that we wanted to say that this Mishnah regarding Shemitah is not Rabbi Yossi. So first we had to prove that. And we proved it's not Rabbi Yossi because Rabbi Yossi would say by grapes, he would have said a certain early stage of a grape, smodar, would be the laws of grapes, when you would not be allowed to cut down a tree, a Shemitah tree. And we said the law was not smodar, but Beiser, Gerua, Beiser, Poilalav, and we said three terms for this grape. And this is a certain stage. The grape it's unripe, but it's the size of a white bean. And once it reaches the size of a white bean, you wouldn't be allowed to cut it down for Shemitah because you would be ruining it. It's called a fruit already. And since it's called a fruit, Shemitah, you wouldn't be allowed to cut it down. And therefore, at that stage, if it has a protection for it, you would need to keep the laws of Arla even for the protection. And what that means is even if it's not ripe, you have to keep the laws of Arla. And that proved wrong our previous assumption that something that's not ripe, you don't have to keep the laws of the protection of it for Arla because not called a fruit. It is called a fruit. Even something not ripe is called a fruit. Now, it depends when, but even if it's not ripe, it's called a fruit. But that made us question the laws of the caper husks. And we explained that the caper husk is different because what it boils down to is if you take off the husk, does the fruit die? If the fruit dies, then you know it's a protection. If the fruit doesn't die, then it's not a protection. And that is the conclusion of the Gemara. Now, the million-dollar question is, so what bracha do you recite on the caper husks? So initially, we wanted to say that the caper husks are ha'etz, right? That's what we were initially saying. We had a statement earlier that on the capers we had different parts of it, different brachas you say on the different parts, and the caper husk we wanted to say a ha'etz. And I must tell you, it's not so simple. It's a very complicated issue. And the next little piece is
I'm reading it on the pond. Does the Gemara also have the parentheses with the
Gemara? Yeah, the Gemara has the parentheses here, and this is very interesting because this parentheses was taken out because the commentaries believe that this was written by the Bahag and it was added mistakenly into the Gemara. Bahag is the Baal Halachis Medolos. Let me pull him up over here. The Baal Halachis Medolos wrote a book of halacha, and it was in the time of the Goinim, and either Rabbi Yehuda Goin, or I guess it's unclear who the source is, but it's from the Goinic period, and that was like right after the Gemara. So all the Rishonim, all the commentaries that we know of the Gemara are from later, and they tell us that this statement must have been from one of those rabbis, and it mistakenly got included in the Gemara. Now, this statement is something that a lot of the rabbis want to argue, and it's written inside our Gemara, but it has parentheses, and it says V'hilchasa Kamar bar Ravashi, the law follows Mar bar Ravashi. The Zarekas of Yoinais, he threw out the caper berries and he ate the caper husks. And since it's not considered a fruit regarding Arla, it shouldn't be a fruit regarding blessings. So he wants to say it's not a you shouldn't recite bar priya eitz, ela bar priya dama, but rather you should say who creates the fruit from the ground, because it's not really fruit of a tree, because we're telling you don't have to keep Arla. If it was really fruit, you would have to keep the laws of Arla. But since it's not a fruit, you see he's eating it. He's eating it because it's not a fruit. If it's not a fruit, then don't say the bracha bar pri ha'etz, say the bracha bar pri ha'adam. Now, this is not so simple, because it would seem that you could say, no, really, it is a fruit. But outside of Israel, we can rely on Rabbi Akiva, who holds it's not a fruit. But we hold it is a fruit, but we happen to be allowed to eat it because Arla has special laws that you don't have to keep Arla. But it really is a fruit. So you could argue, this is, and a lot of the commentaries want to argue on this statement. It's not that it's considered not a fruit. It's a fruit. The caper husk is a fruit. But regarding Arla, we can be lenient. It's not considered regarding Arla. We can follow that view. It's not a fruit. It's also not considered a protection for the fruit, because if you take it off, the fruit doesn't die. So it doesn't have the laws of Arla. But it's not that it's not a fruit. It is a fruit. So this is a very serious discussion. Maybe we'll talk about it more tomorrow, Mr. Shem.